Hello, everyone. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to bring some analytic specificity and perhaps concreteness to A. Richards' suggestion that there is an interaction between a metaphoric vehicle and topic that we should be concerned with, in particular in our understanding of poetic metaphors. What is the nature of that interaction? One aspect of the issues that arise from that question is the possibility of bidirectionality. Quite often, metaphor comprehension is understood as a unidirectional mapping of the vehicle onto the topic, and it may provide a novel construal of the topic, especially by virtue of the selection of the attributes of the vehicle. But the more interesting possibility, as far as we are concerned, is the possibility of bidirectional interaction between the vehicle and topic. There's a possibility that there is selective identification of attributes of the vehicle and topic that were not previously salient for either the vehicle or topic, and that these may reflect not just novelty, but an emergent meaning of the metaphor, describing attributes that are common to the vehicle and topic. So what is the nature of the interaction? Another issue is whether there is something like integration of those selected attributes of the vehicle and topic, whether that integration forms a certain kind of composite. One possibility is that the composite is an additive conjoining of features of the vehicle and topic. The more interesting one from our point of view is that the composite that results integrates features of the vehicle and topic. In all prayer is grief flying, for example. The anguish of grief and the ascent of prayer generate an ad hoc category that has a single complex feature. All prayer has an attribute that integrates anguish with ascending to create grief flying, for example. So the objectives of the present pair of studies is to demonstrate the possibility of bidirectional interaction between the vehicle and topic of a poetic metaphor, as well as demonstrate evidence of the interactive integration of the features of the vehicle and metaphoric vehicle and topic as the outcome. To do this study, we selected metaphors from the normed list of literary and non-literary metaphors provided by Katz and colleagues. In particular, we decided to focus on All Prayer is Grief Flying, which is extracted from the Dylan Thomas poem entitled The Conversation of Prayer. In study 1, 184 participants completed a 24-item questionnaire that assessed their explication of the Thomas poem through their response to this metaphor. And similarly, in study 2, 340 participants completed a modified version of that same questionnaire in their explication of the primary metaphor in the poem. The poem itself presents the metaphor in wording that is slightly different than is extracted by Katz and company, but it is also fairly explicit. The sound about to be said of the two prayers, for the sleep in a safe land and the love who dies will be the same grief flying. In response to those lines from the poem, we invited respondents to rate a series of items that indicated literal similarity between prayers and grief flying. Both, for example, may be forms of longing. 7 of the items also indicated A is B, metaphoric form, where attributes of B are mapped onto A, prayers are a form of anguish. And conversely, B is A items, 7A, B is A items were included to indicate the possibility that attributes of the topic are mapped back onto the metaphoric vehicle. Grief flying occurs in a place of worship, for example. The questionnaire also included items concerning metaphoric personal identification between sort of the reader and the vehicle and topic, and Sean Douglas will be talking about that a little bit later in this conference. We did a cluster analysis of those items. Ward's method followed by K-means analysis, fairly familiar procedures used in both studies 1 and 2. And similarly, in both studies, we found that there was a cluster of individuals who provided robust ratings on the subset of literal sameness items, the metaphoric A is B items, the metaphoric B is A items, and finally, the items reflective of personal identification, metaphors of personal identification. Similarly, in study 2, you get that in a single cluster, in this case, cluster 1. You get the literal similarity, A is B mapping, the B is A mappings, and the metaphors of personal identification. This is a basic choice point because to protect the information concerning interactive relations between the input values, it may be misguided to use linear procedures, in particular multiple regressions, let's say of the 24 items. We wanted to at least consider whether it's possible to train a connectionist network to learn these cluster profiles, and perhaps along the way provide evidence of bidirectional mappings of the input values and interactive integration of the input values during metaphor comprehension. So we trained a parallel distributed processing network, 5 hidden units, to identify membership in the 5 identified clusters. Of course, our particular interest was in the target cluster, cluster 2 in study 1, cluster 1 in study 2. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that PDP models retain nonlinear and interactive relations among the pairs of inputs. Nonlinear, non-additive relations on the one hand, but also interactive relations are retained within PDP models and may be occluded in use of linear regression models. So the first question then is to go to conduct analyses that might indicate sort of a predictive advantage of retaining that information. So we examined a hierarchical linear regression model with all 24 inputs as independent variables. In the second step, activation levels for all 5 PDP hidden units as independent variables, and then cluster 2 membership as the dependent variable in study 1. Then you find rather robust evidence of increased variance accounted for using the PDP hidden unit information, suggesting that perhaps the PDP model is protecting that interaction information that is probably pivotal in clarifying the nature of emergent meaning configurations. Same in study 2. The predictive advantage for the PDP model is clear-cut, statistically significant, and provides further indication that yes, perhaps the PDP model is protecting some of the information pertaining to interactions among the input values that would be of interest to anybody who's concerned with emergent meanings. We also decided, though, that we might need to go further to get out of the black box that's often associated with the use of PDP connectionist networks. And in particular, we wanted to identify interactions among the hidden unit activations that may be the source of metaphorically generated emergent meanings. So the first step is to identify those interactions, and one way of doing that, and there are a couple of other things that we tried, but one way of doing that is just visually to look at the profiles of hidden unit weights. In this case, in study 1, it looks as though the meaning of hidden unit activation, hidden unit 2 activation may depend upon deactivation of hidden unit 4, which predicts cluster 5, or activation of that hidden unit, which predicts cluster 2. Similarly, you get an interaction of roughly the same kind in study 2, where the meaning of activation of hidden unit 1 may depend upon activation of hidden unit 4, which predicts cluster 2, or deactivation of hidden unit 4, which predicts cluster 1, the target cluster. So there are interactions between the activation levels of hidden units that differentially predict cluster membership. Just to give you some hint of what we have in mind as we look at this kind of information, it is possible that among members of the target clusters in these two studies, hidden unit interactions may differentially predict sort of the felt sense or the mood of the poetic metaphor. The respondent may be able to say something like, of this but not that input item conveys something about the meaning of the metaphor. It's vague in that way. But it is also vague in a way that we hope to dissolve a little bit or resolve a little bit further, rather than an unspecified array of items from the questionnaire. We wanted to see whether we could specify them more clearly. So the first effort to get more specific was to look at an interaction term involving both A is B and B is A input items. So we averaged the A is B input items, averaged the B is A input items, and then calculated their cross product. And that became our dependent variable in a regression model that included activation levels for all 5 hidden units, but also separately the hidden unit interaction terms, HID2, HID4 in study 1, HID1, HID4 in study 2. And in both studies, we find, as indicated here, that the partial correlation for the interaction that is separate from the variance accounted for by activation of the 5 hidden units more directly is statistically reliable. And so there's something, again, being protected there in that interaction term, and it's there in both studies. So the partial correlation then is a hint that there is something of potential interest in that hidden unit interaction term that predicts A is B and B is A mappings conjointly. But we also wanted to be more specific, get a little bit closer to the details of those input items, in particular pairs of A is B and B is A items that might more specifically be predicted by the model, the PDP model. So we created the 49 bidirectional item cross products. Each of the A is B items cross with each of the B is A items gives you 49 interaction terms. And then we put that into, again, a hierarchical regression model in which the raw input values, 24 input values, were included in the first step. The activation of all 5 hidden units was included in a second step. The interaction between the hidden unit interaction or activation level terms, the interaction was the third step, and the outcome was the specific bidirectional pairs of A is B and B is A input items. And when you do that in both studies, interestingly enough, there is a kind of coalescence around 4 interactive integrations. Among the entire set of 49 cross products, the ones that seem to make a difference are those in which the A is B items include prayer or a form of mourning, prayers are a form of anguish, and prayers occur in loneliness. And B is A items, grief is an invocation, grief is asking for what seems impossible. So the preceding results are compatible with the notion that the hidden unit interactions do not only differentially predict cluster membership overall, but they predict both that bidirectional interaction term, the average of A is B and B is A items and their cross products, and a subset of specific bidirectional input pairs. Roughly speaking, all prayer is grief is a metaphor that can be understood by extending the metaphor we suggest. Prayer and grief are a mournful, anguished, lonely invocation asking for the impossible. Notice how we basically put that into a single statement, roughly speaking, a hyphenation of the terms that went into these specific input pairs. Extending a metaphor in the way that is suggested by these input pairs is a part of how, according to Ricoeur, poetic metaphor lives. We went just a little bit further to examine the possibility that there is perhaps a sequence here, moving from literal to bidirectional metaphoric mappings. So in both studies, what we did find is that the average literal input items, the average of those specific items, was predicted by the combination of activation levels among the 5 hidden units, but not the interaction terms. The interaction terms do not predict literal meanings or the endorsement of literal meanings. As though perhaps ad hoc literal abstractions or literal pre-metaphoric target pairs are where this process begins, a kind of resonance between neighboring concepts, resonance between categories such as sharks and lawyers, prayer and grief in our case. That first step may be followed by the kind of bidirectional interaction that eventually provides metaphors of personal identification. The evidence that we have in these 2 studies indicates that it may result from a model that either involves the A is B, B is A interaction term, or more specifically, those 4 item-specific interaction items or interaction terms. You get the same outcome, metaphors of personal identification, if you include either the aggregate interaction term or the more specific interaction terms in the model. But perhaps this intimate outcome, especially involving the 4 specific interaction items, is the kind that may be of particular interest to those who are concerned with emergent meaning. In summary, it may be possible to personify the PDP network and suggest a 3-phase model of poetic metaphor comprehension. Within the model that we think we have suggestive evidence to support, the process begins with literal juxtaposition of neighboring categories. There is some independent evidence that this is where metaphoric comprehension begins anyway, but detecting semantic similarity, literal similarity across contrasting domains may be the point of departure. Flutes and birds, prayer and grief, literally understood, may constitute the resonance that is not yet explicitly metaphorical, but nonetheless the point of departure for metaphor comprehension. The second phase may be one in which there is bidirectional exploration of A as B, B as A mappings. Exploration of vehicle and topic attribute transformations are included, and that also often includes metaphoric transformations of the attributes into an analogical form, polysemy, and so on. And that kind of oscillation between A as B and B as A attribute transformations may be of particular importance to Goodblatt and Glickson. It does not yet constitute their integrative interaction, but the A as B, B as A oscillation is movement in that direction. And the third phase is one in which the integrative interactions themselves are explicated, becoming the source of attribute transformations in an extended metaphor. This is a point at which there's a kind of lifting out of those specific interactive integrations that may provide an experiential felt shift, may provide the means by which a living metaphor remains alive in its extension. Thank you very much.